I have spoken in the past on the mark of the beast, but it was before the COVID-19 era. And so I thought I'd update my notes. So the first part, there's going to be quite a bit of excerpts from medical experts and so on. So you'll just have to bear with me as I read those, but it's necessary that we get informed opinions of those. The latter part, I'll look at some of the scriptures. So we're going to be addressing the issue of the COVID-19 vaccine and whether Christians should take it or not. Just to tell you what you probably already know, if you haven't realized, we're in the middle of a pandemic. COVID-19 is an infectious disease, and most people who fall sick with it will experience mild to moderate symptoms and recover without special treatment. How does it spread? The virus is mainly transmitted through droplets generated when an infected person coughs, sneezes, or exhales, hence why we wear the masks. The droplets are too heavy to hang in the air and quickly fall on floors or surfaces, but obviously people touch surfaces and then they touch their nose and their eyes and their mouth, and that way you get infected. So the importance of constantly washing your hands or disinfecting your hands, as you probably already know. The stats as of this morning were so far worldwide 207 million infections, and there have been over 4 million reported deaths. And in our own country, we've had 2.58 million infections and 76,631 reported deaths. So we're dealing with a pandemic that's certainly up there with a lot of the worst pandemics that the world has seen. Now, according to the Washington Post, on the 16th of February this year, they say some churches and Christian ministries with large online followings, as well as Christian influencers on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, and YouTube, are making false claims that vaccines contain fetal tissue or microchips, or construing associations between vaccine ingredients and the devil. Others talk about how coronavirus vaccines and masks contain or herald the mark of the beast. So I just want to look at a few of those issues and as to whether there's any truth in them. So firstly, do COVID-19 vaccines contain microchips that'll be able to track your whereabouts? So one of the claims is that Microsoft owns a patent, World Order 666, which involves inserting microchips into people. And according to this claim, the former Microsoft CEO, who is no longer the CEO, Bill Gates, started the COVID-19 pandemic so that he could insert microchips into people around the world under the guise of providing vaccinations. Like a lot of these conspiracy theories, there's an element of truth in it. Microsoft did publish a patent for a cryptocurrency system using body activity data. If you don't know what a cryptocurrency is, that's things like Bitcoin, these digital currencies, and they normally get generated by computers, but they have this patent which is filed under the number W0-2020-060606. And so there are those who claim in the WO stands for World Order, and there you have the 666 in there. But as you can see, it contains 3 sixes, but it's not the same as 666. The WO doesn't stand for World Order. It's an abbreviation for the World Intellectual Property Organization, which is the organization that grants the patents. But the patent, if you go read it, and it is online, it's actually for tracking body activity via wearable technologies, such as smart watches. A lot of people have them nowadays. So there's no mention, if you read it, of implanted microchips, of 5G technology, or vaccines. So it's a half-truth. Tracking microchips in vaccines. There's a video on TikTok showing people being implanted with a tracking microchip. It features a poor quality screen grab from a news broadcast with an overlaid text reading the RFID chip coming in all corona vaccine shots in the next 18 months mark of the beast. Now, the footage has been manipulated. It's been cropped and taken out of context. In fact, the video is showing a 2017 report, so this is before we even had COVID, from an NBC News Today show, which was about a Wisconsin company which offered its employees the chance to have a microchip implant in their finger that they could use to buy snacks, log into computers, or activate the copy machine. So it is about an implant, but it was about one that was used in Wisconsin in 2017. Nothing to do with the mark of the beast. A video shared over 27,000 times on Facebook implies that the COVID-19 vaccine will contain a tracking microchip that's going to be injected into the individuals. And then once you've got that, they'll be able to know where you are, besides the fact that most people already carry a tracking device with them. It's called a phone. Okay, but they're going to be able to know where you are. This is false. The video is a compilation of out of context or manipulated footage, which includes news reports and commentary from Bill and Melinda Gates that have been selectively combined. It also includes portions of a May 2020 CBN interview with Jay Walker, who is the executive chairman of a company called Epiject, who got a contract to produce the injectors for the COVID-19 vaccine in the United States. And he's asked about how an optional RFID microchip, RFID stands for radio frequency identification, very popular term nowadays, tiny microchips, how it would work. So that sounds quite ominous, doesn't it? But if you look at his full response, not the edited one, he actually compares the technology to a barcode, assures it doesn't carry any personal information. But then Steve Hoffman, who's also a spokesman for the company, said that the optional microchip is not injected into the individual who receives the vaccine. In fact, it's actually part of the syringe label, not the injectable substance. And the purpose for it was to confirm that the actual injectable and the vaccine in it has not expired, and that it is not counterfeit, and it would also confirm that the particular injection has been used, and they use it in conjunction with the cell phone app, but it is on the actual syringe, not on the actual liquid. In fact, RFID chip currently wouldn't fit through the syringe anyway. They are making them smaller and smaller and smaller, but currently, from what I could see, you don't get one that would be small enough to pass through a syringe. So you don't need to worry that if you went for your vaccine, they slipped a microchip into you unknowingly. I know Daniel was very worried when I said I was going to speak on this. He phoned me and asked, why did I wait till he had had the vaccine? He's a bit worried I'm going to tell him he's got the mark of the beast. Okay. This one is actually very interesting. I was quite surprised when I looked it up. Do COVID vaccines contain fetal tissue, which some are claiming? Fetal tissue, that means tissue from aborted fetuses. The answer might surprise you. The response from infectious disease expert James Lawler is no. The COVID-19 vaccines do not contain any aborted fetal cells. But he does point out that depending on the vaccine, fetal cell lines are used at different stages of the product development. I'm just going to explain to you what that means. Fetal cell lines are not the same as fetal tissue, which comes from abortion, but they have been grown in a lab, and they do descend from cells that were originally taken from elective abortions in the 1970s and 1980s. I found that quite surprising. Those individual cells from the 1970s and 1980s have been multiplied into new cells over the past 4 or 5 decades, creating what they call fetal cell lines. And so the current fetal cell lines are thousands of generations removed from the original fetal tissue, and they do not contain any tissue from a fetus, although they are descended from it in a lab. Now, vaccine makers have 3 stages of their development where they may or may not use these fetal cell lines. The one is the development, where they identify what works and they need some sort of human tissue to test it on. Then there's the confirmation, making sure that it works. And then the production, manufacturing the formula that works, actually putting something in what goes into production. Now, neither the Pfizer nor the Moderna vaccines use fetal cell lines during the development or production phases, but both of them do use the fetal cell line HEK293 in the confirmation phase. So it's in one of their phases of development. And all of those cells are descended from tissue that was taken from a 1973 elective abortion that took place in the Netherlands. And that's not from a conspiracy site, that's from a scientific site. Johnson & Johnson uses fetal cell lines in all three stages. To make the virus vector vaccine, Johnson & Johnson infects what's called PRC6 fetal cell lines with adenovirus. All PRC6 cells used to manufacture the vaccine are descended from tissue taken from a 1985 elective abortion that also took place in the Netherlands. And they use this cell line because it is a well-studied industry standard for safe and reliable production of viral vector vaccines. It's a different type of vaccine. But I do want to tell you that none of the vaccines use fetal cells that are taken from recent abortions, but there still might be some people who would have an ethical issue with that, and that's why it's good to be able to make a fully informed decision. However, if you do have a problem with that, and this is what I found even more alarming, because I doubt that many people knew it, including myself, apparently since the 1960s, they've used elective cells derived from elective abortions to manufacture vaccines, which include vaccines against rubella, chickenpox, hepatitis A, and shingles. So if you have a problem with the virus in that account, well, then you should have a problem with a lot of other vaccines. But it is quite alarming nonetheless. They've also been used to make approved drugs against diseases, including hemophilia, rheumatoid arthritis, and cystic fibrosis. So that's how our medical industry operates. They're using their cells, albeit that they're not taken from fetuses, they are grown in a lab descended from original fetal cells, and they use it for their testing. Just to tell you, obviously no bearing necessary on what your stance needs to be, but the Roman Catholic Church, the Vatican Pontifical Academy for Light, declared in 2005 and reaffirmed in 2017 that in the absence of alternatives, Catholics could, in good conscience, receive vaccines made using historical human fetal cell lines. But it's obviously a matter of conscience. There might be some people who still have an issue with that, but then, as I say, you can't selectively target just the one vaccine, because apparently this is how they test almost all vaccines. Do COVID vaccines alter your DNA? And this is a concern some people have and a claim that's been made. Now, the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines do slip a single strand of genetic material, which is called messenger RNA, mRNA, into your cells. But according to this Oxford professor, Jeffrey Alland, injecting RNA into someone does nothing to human cell DNA. It works by instructing the body to produce a protein found on the surface of the coronavirus. The immune system then learns how to recognize and produce antibodies against that protein. Again, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is different. Is an adenovirus vector vaccine. Now, adenovirus is the virus that causes the common cold. But the virus in this vaccine has been changed so that it does not cause illness. And I'm just going to read this to you. With this type of vaccine, a carrier, in this case adenovirus, acts as a delivery vehicle. The adenovirus has had the coronavirus spike protein added to its DNA. The adenovirus carries that genetic material into your body, delivering its modified DNA to your cells. Your cells will then make the spike protein, activating your immune system. Once activated, your immune system creates antibodies to fight off the spike protein. I hope you followed all that, but if not, you've got the notes. You can go read it a couple of times. Quite technical as to how these things work. Very different from traditional vaccines, and that is the problem that some people have, that it's different, that there must be something sinister. Do they contain the real virus? It's one of the virus's most recognizable features. Our cells read this mRNA and they use them to assemble the spikes. The spikes migrate to the outside of our cells where they are recognized and remembered by the immune system. And the spikes by themselves are not dangerous. They can't make you sick, and they are essentially what they call a mugshot. They look similar. That help the body recognize and fight off the real perpetrator when it comes along. So it's just to train the immune system. The mRNA chains from the vaccines only last for a couple of days before they break down and the pieces are swept away by the body's normal waste disposal system. These are excerpts, as I say, from credible sites. And so you don't need to worry that the DNA, your DNA will be altered by the COVID-19 vaccine. And so I'm just going to read you one more lot of excerpts here, just explaining this to you, because this is also quite technical. Paul Offit, who's a pediatrician in America who specializes in infectious diseases and vaccines and immunology and virology, he says, for the vaccines to alter a person's genes, the mRNA instructions would have to enter the cell's control center, the nucleus. The nucleus is walled off, so it's got some sort of a firewall, if you want to put it in computer terms. It's walled off from the rest of the cell by its own membrane. To get past that membrane, the mRNA would have to have an enzyme called a nuclear access signal, which it doesn't have. Even if it could get into the nucleus, the single strand of mRNA would have to be translated back into a double-stranded DNA, because RNA and DNA are not exactly the same. HIV, the virus that causes AIDS, can do this. It uses an enzyme like reverse transcriptase to insert itself back into our chromosomes. The mRNA in the vaccines lacks this enzyme, so it can't turn back into DNA. But again, Johnson & Johnson is different. The adenovirus does actually enter the nucleus of the cells in this case, but it never integrates into our chromosomes. Even after those two steps, there's a third firewall, amazing how our bodies are made, between the vaccines and our genes. Another enzyme called an integrase would be needed to stitch the new DNA into the DNA of our cells. That's also not in the vaccines. So the chances are zero that it can happen, according to Offit, who's an expert, that your DNA can be altered. Now, this is one of the more bizarre claims someone sent to me. And I was quite surprised to see the mention of the God gene, because the God gene theory, because that's all it is, wasn't invented by a Christian. Well, he's not a Christian as far as I know. And so their claim in this video that they've posted is that the vaccine is going to destroy this God gene inside of you, which is apparently a gene which makes you spiritual, believe it or not. Now, I'm going to read this to you from Wikipedia about the God gene theory. It's based on one unproven idea proposed in 2004 by a geneticist, although it's obviously not widely accepted, Dean Hammer. And he claimed that human spirituality is influenced by heredity, and that a specific gene, which is called VMAT2, predisposes certain humans towards being godly or not. So if you've got this gene, you're going to be spiritual. If you don't have it, maybe you're an atheist. I want to tell you that I checked up, this is the same guy who says there's a gay gene, which very few people believe as well. He claims that there's a gay gene which predisposes certain men to being homosexual. We know that that's a choice. If it wasn't a choice, it seems strange that God would judge people for something that is just a genetic predisposition. So that theory says that you've got this God gene and you get the virus targets the God gene, and suddenly you're not going to be spiritual anymore. But if you believe in a God gene, as I told the person who sent me this, it's a form of determinism or fatalism, and it's contrary to the Bible teaching. It says in Joshua 25, verse 15, choose for yourself whom you will serve. Following God is a choice. It's not based on genetics that you inherited, where you make a choice, or you can't make a choice. It also tells us in the Bible, in 2 Peter 3, verse 9, that the Lord is not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. If that is true, then why doesn't the Lord just give everybody the God gene? Okay, and then they'll all be saved. Being saved has got nothing to do with your genetics. It's a choice that you make. Obviously, it's a gift of God. We are told in Ephesians 2, verse 8 to 9, the faith that he gives us, the grace, but we do still make the choice using our free will, because we are created in the image of God, the Bible tells us, as free will agents. So you're not going to inadvertently have your God gene, which doesn't exist, destroyed by a vaccine. Are there harmful side effects with the COVID vaccines? Now, as I pointed out, it's true that some of the COVID-19 vaccines are using a new technology and are some of the first vaccines to work this way. But the technology was years in the making. So don't be concerned that they just started it now. They had been working on it for some time, but they did get a bit of a major cash injection from what was known Operation Warp Speed. Due to the pandemic, this Operation Warp Speed, which is a public-private partnership initiated by the US government, they injected millions into this development, or maybe even billions, to facilitate and accelerate the development of these new type of vaccines. And the vaccines have now been given to millions of people. They're some of the most effective in the world at preventing severe outcomes from COVID infections. So far, they're holding up well against all viral variants. Bear in mind, these things are new. It might turn out that there are side effects that are only discovered years later, as is quite common in the medical field. But the side effects that are listed by the World Health Organization are said to be mostly mild to moderate and short-lasting. And they include fever, and this depends obviously on which one you get. Fever, fatigue, headache and muscle pain, chills, diarrhea, and pain at the injection site. More serious or long-lasting side effects to vaccines are possible, according to the World Health Organization, but extremely rare. I must tell you that there is one pretty serious one that has been discovered, and was first noted in Israel, and that is a side effect of the Pfizer and BioNTech vaccine, which appears to put young men at an elevated risk of developing a heart muscle inflammation called myocarditis. In April 2021, the Israeli health officials reported that there were more than 60 cases, mostly in young men, who'd received their second dose of vaccine a few days earlier. And about the same time, the US Department of Defense also began to track 14 such cases. And in Europe, the European Medicine Agency said on 28th of May that they'd received 107 reports of myocarditis following the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, or about 1 in 175,000 doses administered. So you can see it is pretty low, but that is a pretty serious side effect. So there could potentially be side effects, and that's why obviously you need to make an informed decision, but bearing in mind that any medical procedure, any vaccine, there is some sort of an element of risk. And you need to balance as to whether the risk of not taking it is greater than the risk of taking it. So getting to the biblical part, is the vaccine the mark of the beast? There you can just see that there's some guys in Texas. Texas will not take the mark of the beast. Okay, so the Texans aren't going to take it, apparently. They're tough enough to go without the vaccine. So in Revelation 13, there are two beasts presented in Revelation 13. There's already been one introduced in Revelation 12, the dragon, the beast in the sky, who is Satan. We then get two beasts, a beast that comes out of the sea, Antichrist, a political leader, and he gets his authority from the dragon. He's not the same as the dragon. He gets his authority, we are told, from the dragon. Just like Satan offered the authority to Jesus, if you worship me, I'll give you all these kingdoms. That appears that the Antichrist is a man who accepts, and he takes the kingdoms of the world, the authority, in return for allegiance to Satan. But then there's a second beast, comes from the earth. So remember, the dragon from the sky is Satan. The beast from the sea is the Antichrist. The one from the earth is the false prophet, we call him. He's not called that in Revelation, but that's a term that we've come to use. He's the sidekick of the Antichrist, the second beast, and performs great signs. So the Antichrist is a political leader and a military leader, whereas the false prophet is more a religious leader. If you read Revelation 13, you'll find it's actually the false prophet who forces people to take the mark. So indirectly, it's the Antichrist, but really it's the false prophet. Speaking of the second beast, it says it forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands or on their foreheads, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. That number is 666. I'm not going to speak on 666 because that's a topic all on its own. I have addressed it before and we don't have time for that today. So just to remind you, those of you who've done Bible college, or if you've paid attention to some of my previous ministries, you'll know that there are three main views on prophecy in terms of timing. The one is preterism, which says that most or all of the biblical prophecies from Revelation and Daniel were actually fulfilled in the 1st century. They've already been fulfilled. So when you're reading Revelation, you're actually reading history, not prophecy. Historicism says that the prophecies are fulfilled gradually throughout the history of the church age. Futurists, the one that we hold to, and which is the predominant view among evangelicals, is that most of the prophecies are going to be fulfilled in the future. So there's just a quick overview. Preterism says they've already been fulfilled, the prophecies, before 70 AD. Historicists say they gradually fulfilled over history. They still believe there are some that will be fulfilled in the future, but they read all events throughout history as being a gradual fulfillment of Revelation. Futurism, which is the view that we hold to, is that the majority will be fulfilled in the future, particularly during a 7-year period known as the tribulation, where the Antichrist and the false prophet have dominion over the nations of the earth. Now, how do the different proponents of those views interpret the mark of the beast? Obviously, if you're a preterist, the mark of the beast has already happened, and so they view it as an emperor's image on the Roman coins, because a lot of them will say Nero was the Antichrist. Some of them say it's a certificate of sacrifice to the emperor that people had to produce in order to show that they regarded the emperor as a god. Historicists, some say it's the practice of making the sign of the cross because they see the Catholic Church as the ultimate boogeyman. The Seventh-day Adventists will tell you it's an international Sunday law. But the futurist view, which is the view we hold to, is that it's, portrayed as a mark of commerce. You cannot buy or sell without it. So it's most likely a credit facility in the form of a microchip implant or RFID tag if you look at modern technology. But it's more than that. So quickly, preterists. As I explained, they say all prophecies fulfilled in the 1st century, and they at least believe that the mark is linked to currency because they say it's Roman coins and the image of the beast is the emperor's image on there. But if you think about it, it's not really a very great prophetic sign to say that you won't be able to buy or sell unless you have money. because throughout most of human history, you couldn't buy or sell unless you had money. So if you're going to see that as John giving a great prophetic sign, it's really not a sign at all. Others say, well, it was the certificate that you had to produce where you would go and offer some incense to the emperor, and then you had the certificate, and they said that's the mark of the beast. Because at one stage in history, Christians were compelled to obtain a certificate proving that they'd participated in emperor worship, and if they didn't have it, they were killed. Bit of a problem with that, because these guys say Jesus came in the 1st century. Those certificates were only issued in 250 AD, which is the middle of the 3rd century. And so they found a whole lot of them, and there's one I'm showing you there, and all of them come from mid-3rd century, because it was during a persecution by an emperor, Roman emperor known as Decius, and he issued an edict requiring all citizens to sacrifice to the emperor in the presence of a Roman official, and then you'd get a certificate, libellus, proving that they'd done it, and then you could show. And there's no way, even if you are a preterist, that could be the mark of the beast, because it's 2 centuries too late. Jehovah's Witnesses are historicists, and they represent the beast as being human government. So it's a very generic thing. It's just human government in general. And they say that the mark is a symbol that identifies its bearer as one who gives worshipful support to the beast-like political systems of the world. That's from their own website, by the way. So they've got a very generic view of it. So hence why they dislike government, and they won't serve in the army, and they won't stand at attention to the flag or sing the national anthem, because they just see in general that human government is the beast. Seventh-day Adventists are also historicists, but they at least place the mark of the beast in the future. But they say that it's a universal Sunday law. Bear in mind, Seventh-day Adventists say we shouldn't actually be meeting today. We're supposed to have met yesterday. So we've got a big problem. We're worshiping on the wrong day, and God's very upset about that, because it's very important to him whether you worship him on a Friday or Saturday or Sunday. Okay, so they say the mark of the beast is a future universal Sunday law which would enforce Sunday worship. Now, how likely is that? Because in their system, they say the second beast is the United States of America. Now, remember, the mark is enforced by the second beast. So if you follow their theory to a logical conclusion, they're saying that the United States, which is a predominantly Protestant country, where most Christians already worship on Sunday, is going to pass a Sunday law to force the Protestants to worship on Sunday, which they already do, okay, on the Catholic Sunday, according to them, despite the fact that most of them already do without any enforcement. Other historicists, and as I pointed out, they're generally very anti-Catholic, will say that the mark of the beast is making the sign of the cross, because they see the Roman Catholic Church as being the beast. And, you know, the Antichrist is not necessarily just one pope, but the papacy in general. But if you think about it as well, read about it. When were people unable to buy or sell if they didn't make the sign of the cross? And so the futurist view of the mark of the beast, which is the predominant view among evangelicals, says that most of Revelation, well, not most of prophecy is in the future, but Revelation 13 is in the future. And that the mark is going to be enforced by the end-time world ruler, the false prophet. Buying and selling refers to commerce. Without the mark, people will not be able to engage in commercial activity. And so it's most likely, at this stage anyway, of the technical development in the world, a credit facility in form of a microchip or a RFID tag. There you can see a RFID chip compared to a grain of rice, very small chips which have been planted in humans. In fact, they've been implanted in pets, quite common today for identifying lost pets. They use them to be able to scan the pet to see who they belong to. And there are many cases of these. I thought I'd just give you one for the sake of time. In November 2018, The Guardian reported on the concerns of the Trade Union Congress regarding a proposed rollout by some British companies wanting to implant staff with microchips to improve security. a lot of this has been done. Some people even voluntarily planted microchips inside themselves. So the technology is there. But according to this article in The Guardian, UK firm BioMETRIC, which offers the implants to businesses and individuals, has already fitted 150 implants in the UK. The tiny chips implanted in the flesh between the thumb and the forefinger are similar to those for pets. They enable people to open their front door, access their office, start their car with a wave of their hand, and can also store medical data. So the technology is there to have a mark that's in your hand or on your forehead. Remember, the Bible alludes to that. And so we believe that the Antichrist is going to expedite the creation of a single world currency and a cashless society. Now, the Bible doesn't explicitly say that. So why do we believe that? Well, if you think about it, if you don't have a cashless society, how could the Antichrist enforce a system that you couldn't buy or sell without the mark? Because then people could just say, well, I'll pay by cash. If you don't have the option for cash, then you can force people because they have no other option. Currently, that's not possible. How will this thing be marketed or presented to people? Well, if you think about it, if it weren't for the biblical prophecies, it's, you know, maybe a pretty good system. Because they'll say we're going to use it to combat cash-based crime. Most people don't buy drugs using their credit card or AK-47s or whatever. They typically do it in cash, so it can't be tracked. Bank robberies, the arms trade, money laundering. Counter-terrorism, again. A lot of that's done with cash. So they'll say, well, this is good to restrict terrorist funding, to prevent the evasion of international sanctions. Some countries evade sanctions by doing deals that don't go through the banks. And also increasing the tax base. That's why governments will like it, because some people avoid tax by doing cash sales, which they don't declare, and hence they pay less tax. If you don't have cash and you're forced to do it via the bank, well, that's great. The government's happy. You pay them more. So we need to realize, if you haven't realized already, that money isn't just physical anymore. It's also digital. Zeros and ones stored in a computer. When you go look at your bank balance on your app or your PC, that's just something that exists in a computer. Some economists are predicting that the US dollar may soon be a thing of the past. One economist, Robert Reich, and this is from 2012, says there will be a time, I don't know when, I can't give you a date, when physical money is just going to cease to exist. So a cashless society makes sense in terms of the prophecies as seen by futurists, because you need a cashless society to enforce a system where people can't buy or sell without a mark. So by implication, we believe in a cashless society. Many countries are actively pursuing policies for a global cashless society. Doing business without physical currency is not only feasible, but probable. Obviously, some countries are further down the road than others. But in Sweden, 95% of all retail sales are cashless. The government of Denmark has a stated goal of eradicating cash by 2030. A MasterCard study revealed that approximately 80% of all consumer transactions in the United States are now cashless. And a web article from 2014 reported that a committee chaired by Netanyahu's chief of staff had come up with a three-phase plan to do away with all cash transactions in Israel. Most countries are working towards that goal. And the reasons being what I stated earlier, to combat terrorism, the drug trade, maybe, you know, misguided in the light of biblical prophecy, but they sound like good reasons. Now, in the Niv Bible and in most modern English Bibles, it speaks about the marks being on the right hand or on the forehead. The Greek preposition there is epi. And so most new Bibles will say on. The KJV and all the early English Bible versions from 1380 to 1833 actually render it as in. So in the KJV, it says to receive a mark in the right hand or in the forehead. So which one is correct? Well, the preposition is broad enough that actually both could be used, and generally they determine it based on context. And obviously on the context, it could really be either. Obviously for futurists, we believe that in makes more sense. It could be on, but it's more secure if it's in, isn't it? So the primary use of epi is on or upon, but it can be legitimately translated as in. In fact, the Vulgate, which Jerome translated in the 5th century, has an unusual rendering in that he rendered it as in the right hand or on the forehead. So in the one case, he rendered epi as in, and in the other case as on, but it can suit either. So we can't make a categorical case for either in or on. The on is the preference for modern English versions, but the older versions opted in favor of in. In certainly suits the idea of an RFID implant. But it's interesting in that the Bible does mention the right hand or the forehead. So in the right hand or in the forehead or on it, if you prefer to translate epi that way, but you're talking about the right hand or the forehead. Doesn't the mark have to be visible? In order that people will be able to see whether you're allowed to buy or sell, according to what we read in Revelation 13. Well, modern technology doesn't have an issue with that, because a scanner linked to a computer could see an invisible chip implant. And certainly some people would prefer it, I think, to be in as opposed to being on the skin. In the book of Ezekiel, God instructs an angel to place a mark on the forehead of the righteous people in Jerusalem so that they're not destroyed in a judgment. Now that's a mark placed by God which is invisible. People can't see it. So it's possible to have an invisible mark. And in Revelation 7, it also speaks about those who serve the Lord as having a seal on the foreheads. And it speaks about the 144,000 elect Israelites as having a seal on their foreheads. Again, it's not likely that that will be visible, but it's a mark so that they are spared from the judgments that come. Paul speaks about the Holy Spirit as being God's seal of ownership on us. It's not a visible seal, it's something that's invisible. But even in technology, it's possible to have an invisible seal. Even if you have a cashless society, if your argument is we're going to get, we're going to clamp down on, terrorism, and we're going to clamp down on money laundering and the drug trade, and so we're going to be cashless. In a cashless society, if you're using a debit or a credit card, you still have a problem with people stealing your card or stealing your identity. A chip implant solves the issue. If you have a chip in your hand, that's going to be a bit difficult. Technology exists today to make a chip similar to those used in smart cards, because they already have a chip, and instead to place that chip under your skin. So the technology is there and can be read by an inexpensive scanner, much like the one at your grocery store. You then become your own smart card. It's not possible to have identity theft. And the very expensive problem of making sure the owner of the card is who he says he is has been solved. That's a quote from my book. I like to quote myself. It enriches my speech. Okay. Okay. There's a possibility that the mark might not be used for commercial activity. So those who are saying, well, they're placing restrictions on people who won't take the COVID vaccine, they're not entirely incorrect. It's not impossible that you could have a mark, and even though it's not used for commercial activity, you can say, well, if you don't have that, you're not allowed to do this. And we certainly see that, happening. Similar to what we're seeing in some countries where people are being prohibited from doing certain things if they don't have COVID-19 vaccines. And many people are rightfully concerned about the very heavy-handed approach that some governments are taking to the vaccines. But that's where the similarity ends. There's no outright prohibition in any country saying if you don't get a COVID vaccine, you can't buy or sell. And even if they did that, as I say, at this moment, well, the person can just use cash. But I was quite surprised to see this. This is from Euronews as well, 9th of August. In Italy, you need a COVID-19 certificate, which is available in both paper and digital formats. It's not an implanted microchip yet, but it's going to be mandatory in their public spaces. The green pass will be compulsory to enter any restaurant or other closed spaces, including gyms, cinemas, and theaters. That's from Euronews, by the way. Long distance travel will also require proof of vaccination or a negative test. And that's not just Italy. There's other countries that implement that as well, that you can't travel if you haven't had vaccination. People who don't respect the rules will face heavy fines from 400 to 1,000 euros. Only Italian students and teachers who have the pass will be allowed in schools and universities. So is it possible for government to have those type of restrictions? Absolutely, they're doing it already, where people now have been restricted in countries like Italy and others, that if you don't take a vaccine, well, then you can't do this, you can't do that. So is it possible to have a future government which says you don't have a mark, you can't buy or sell? Absolutely. Abuse of government power is something that's not new. But what I want to point out to you is the timing when the mark gets enforced. People who are saying this is the mark of the beast, I don't know if they understand that the majority of evangelicals anyway are pre-tribulation rapture believers, where we believe that the Christians aren't here during the tribulation. The book of Revelation covers a period of approximately 7 years, 2 periods of 1,260 days, which we call the tribulation. Now, in the first 3.5 years, the Gentiles trample on the holy city, Jerusalem, and the 2 witnesses preach. That's the first 3.5 years. And there you can read it in Revelation 11, 42 months, 1,260, the first half. In the second 3.5 years, the woman who represents Israel in Revelation 12 flees to the wilderness because she's been persecuted by the Antichrist. Okay, and there you can see Revelation 12, verse 6, that they go into the wilderness again for 3.5 years. So in Revelation 13, which happens after that, we're talking about the second half of the 7-year tribulation. The mark only gets enforced then. So the COVID vaccine cannot be the mark of the beast unless you believe we're in the middle of the tribulation. So just to tell you, according to our belief, Christians are not present when the mark of the beast is enforced. They've been raptured. So our belief, pre-tribulation rapture, is that the present age that we're in, Christians are first removed at the rapture. We're still here, so the rapture hasn't taken place. Then there's a 7-year tribulation. In the first 3.5 years, as I told you, 2 witnesses preach in Jerusalem. It hasn't happened yet. In the middle of the tribulation, there's abomination of desolation in the Jerusalem temple. The Jerusalem temple hasn't been rebuilt yet. The abomination hasn't happened. And the 2 witnesses are killed by the Antichrist in Jerusalem. It hasn't happened. Only after that does the mark of the beast get enforced. From a timing point of view, you can't have the mark of the beast now unless our prophecy view is entirely wrong, which we believe it's not. And then after that, you have the second advent where Jesus returns to judge, and the millennium where Christ rules for 1,000 years. And so the part that I want to close with is that we don't believe that the mark of the beast is simply credit. It's linked to commas, but would God really judge people because they got a different type of credit card? Is God going to judge someone because they took a vaccine, which they thought was to cure a disease? It's not very likely. Why would God punish people for that? You'll find that in Revelation, when he mentions the mark, it always links it to allegiance or worship of the Antichrist. So God's not going to condemn you because you used an alternative to a credit card. It's clear that the mark of the beast seems to include some sort of oath of allegiance to the new world ruler, or perhaps even some ceremony. Remember, like the Romans had, where you had to have the ceremony and you offered to the emperor and then got your little certificate, which entails refuting the ideals of a Judeo-Christian heritage. Because the judgment is not just for receiving the mark, but for the worship of the false Messiah. And I'm going to read you a few passages from Revelation. You'll find that wherever the mark of the beast is mentioned, it talks about worshiping him. The first angel went and poured out his bowl on the land, Revelation 16, verse 2, and ugly and painful sores broke out on the people who had the mark of the beast and worshipped his image. There's worship involved, religious allegiance, not just commas. eternal damnation. Revelation 14, 9 to 11. It says, if anyone worships the beast and his image and receives the mark on the forehead or the hand, again, the two are linked, he will drink the wine of God's fury. It goes on to say there is no rest day or night for those who worship the beast or his image, or for anyone who receives the mark of his name. Always mentioned together. They have the mark and they worship the beast, the Antichrist. Now, those who refuse to take the mark, we're told, are beheaded by the Antichrist. Now, that's pretty harsh, even for the Antichrist, if they're just refusing to take a COVID vaccine, okay, to cut their heads off, okay. I don't know any country that's doing that yet, even the Islamic ones, okay, who like cutting people's heads off. They haven't started chopping your head off if you won't take the vaccine. So the implication is that by refusing to take it or worship his image, they're rejecting his claims to be God, because that's what he does. Paul says in Thessalonians that he sets himself up in the temple claiming to be God. Revelation 24, I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their testimony about Jesus and because of the word of God. Why? They had not worshipped the beast. See, worship again. And they had not received its mark on their forehead or their hands. So it's not the COVID vaccine or any other vaccine or something that's purely a credit card. It's linked not only to buying and selling, but to worship of the beast, the Antichrist. And so here's my concluding slide where I'm going to summarize. What do we know scripturally? Bearing in mind that things about RFID and all that, they're theories. They might, not be correct, but they seem pretty good theories and they seem pretty credible in view of the technology that's out there. So the Bible doesn't say you will receive an RFID chip. It says you'll receive a mark, and it could be in or on. So we know that the false prophet forces people to take the mark, not the South African government or the Italian government, the false prophet. It is in or on, both are allowable, the right hand or forehead. The mark is linked to the number of the Antichrist name, 666. So there's a link somehow to 666. It is linked to commercial activity. If you can still buy or sell and you haven't had, the COVID vaccine, well, it's not the mark of the beast. It is linked to the worship of the Antichrist, and people won't take it accidentally. So Daniel doesn't need to be worried as well, okay? So you won't take it and then someone comes afterwards, gotcha, you took the mark. It will happen in the middle of the future 7-year tribulation, some 3.5 years after Christians have been raptured, according to our understanding of Scripture. Those who refuse to take it are executed by the Antichrist. And those who do take it will be eternally damned by God because of the fact that not only is it linked to commas, it is linked to allegiance, worship of the Antichrist's rejection of God. And that is the summary, folks. So it's really up to your own conscience. As I say, some people do have some ethical issues, as I mentioned, in terms of the use of fetal tissue in the development, but that's an issue you're going to have with all vaccines. And again, the side effects are quite likely not all known. So it's really up to your conscience, but I don't believe that there's any grounds in the Bible, and certainly not the mark of the beast. You're not going to be eternally damned if you have a COVID vaccine. Amen. So we're going to close with this song, which speaks about the fact that soon and very soon, we're going to see our King. He is going to return. Let's stand.